Hello and welcome to the latest Urban Manifesto webinar. I'm Lucy Bullivant. I'm the founder of urbanista.org, my webzine for livable urbanism. And together with Prathima Manohar, the founder of the Urban Vision Think Do Tank, we've created Urban Manifesto, which is a third globally connected online platform. Now, we were prompted to do this because the pandemic and the demands of transitioning into a new era have brought up really profound questions concerning the identities, the policies, and the processes of urban design and planning. So I'm delighted to tell you that today's theme is tactical urbanism. Prathima is going to introduce this along with our two splendid guests in less than a minute. But let me just say that how Urban Manifesto works is that we invite each of our expert guests from different disciplines and backgrounds to present their 3-minute manifesto, 3 priorities for action to create a happier, healthier, more livable, and that means more equitable urban future. And then we delve into the issues in a Q&A, and after which we invite you, our dear guests, our dear audience, to ask our guests questions. So through meeting the challenges brought about by the pandemic, through learning and through unlearning old ways which have lost their relevance or which are downright unhelpful in the 21st century, our manifesto will be a roadmap for progressive, resilient, and responsible urban change. A shout out to our partner, the Architecture Foundation, for live streaming each episode as part of its ongoing 100-day studio online program. So over to you, Prathima. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Welcome to the Urban Manifesto. And today's theme is tactical urbanism. And tactical urbanism is also known as do-it-yourself urbanism, urban acupuncture, collective urbanism, as well as often referred to as pop-up cities. And it's probably one of the most popular tools being used worldwide as we repurpose our cities and urban spaces to deal with this pandemic. It's a powerful tactic to not just empower local authorities and communities to try out urban transformation, but it can lead to long-term revival and regeneration of our urban realm. At its heart, it's also about co-creation and co-production of urban life. And we are so delighted today to have 2 amazing thought leaders in this space. Mike Lydon, the author and advocate and founding principal of Street Plans in New York City. He's also, as many of you know, the co-author of Tactical Urbanism, Short-Term Action and Long-Term Change series, which is a seminal primer on tactical urbanism. And if you've not seen it yet, please do. It's a great resource. And we have Alex Furunes. He's an architect and founder joining us from Norway. He's the founder of Eriksson Furunes Architects, and his practice is also based on participatory design and co-creation. Thank you both for joining us today on this important conversation. And how have you been during this big health crisis and the lockdown? Mike?
Thank you, Lucy and Prathima. We've been fine. Our family is very, very fortunate. We're healthy. We're as happy as we can be, being more confined than normal, and are looking forward to enjoying life in New York City as things are continuing to reopen. So we're in a better spot now than we were in March and April, for sure.
Alex, what about you?
I'm good. My family is good. We're in central Norway. We're living in an old transformed tuberculosis hospital. Mm-hmm. So it's actually quite isolated already in the middle of a forest. So we're pretty safe and all right. Yeah.
It's nice to hear. Our first segment in this series is what we call Urban Manifesto, where we've requested both of you to share a 3-point agenda for the future of tactical urbanism. So Mike, I have your slides up here. Do you want to share with us what your 3-point plan is for the future of a tactical urbanism or pop-up infrastructure?
Yeah, so I think it starts with this kind of idea that city planning really lacks tactics for building cities that work like cities. And that's a wonderful quote from Jane Jacobs. And what I think she meant by that is that our cities are the best in terms of their equity, their inclusion, their dynamism, when we actually work on lots and lots and lots of little plans and little changes to our streets, our public spaces, our buildings. And as a discipline, city planning traditionally has not been good at dealing with small scale change and action. And so I think the first point is that city planning as a discipline needs to be transformed. And there needs to be a understanding from young planners as they go through their training and start to practice professionally that tactical urbanism is not the tool to solve every problem, but it's an important process and methodology to be trained on to be able to apply it when it's most relevant, and through that be able to co-produce our cities with our residents and of course with advocates. And so I think that's my first point, is that city planning really needs to be transformed and think about not just long-term big picture strategies, but also all the little tactics that make our cities wonderful. Next slide. Go to the next slide, please. There we go. So my point two is that tactical urbanism is at its core can be about resilience. We think a lot about cities as a physical place, about the streets and the infrastructure, the lights and the metros and the parks, but really cities are about people. And what tactical urbanism brings about is ways for people to work together in the public realm that actually builds social capital and ties and relationships and builds trust between citizens and their government and, of course, citizens and each other. So it's really important to think about tactical urbanism not as a one-off application, something that might be cheap and cheerful, but really thinking about it as a tool and a methodology for building resilience. And we've seen that to be really primary in some very specific cases globally in the last decade. And I think what really brought this point home to me was working, understanding what was happening in Christchurch, New Zealand, about a decade ago as they suffered multiple earthquakes. And the response was not some large-scale top-down vision that was delivered by the federal government. It was really hundreds of people taking small actions to rebuild their city, connect with each other, and begin the healing process, both physically and socially. And that strain has come through a lot of our work at Street Plans. We've done a lot of work in the past with 100 resilient cities. And so we've really started to think through and how to apply tactical urbanism with a resilience frame. And during the pandemic, we've seen a huge amount of response that is tactical in nature, very provisional, very creative, very quick, low cost, and that being applied to lots of different types of projects. And so think about, my second point is cities really need to be resilient in how they think about delivering tactical urbanism, that you've got shocks and ongoing stresses that play out in people's daily lives in the city, that tactical urbanism can be a response to that for mobility, for social inclusion, for service delivery, etc. And that's something that we worked on closely with NACTO and the Global Designing Cities Initiative this spring and early summer to put together guidance on lots of different types of interventions to help cities both respond to the pandemic and then recover. And then my third and final point is that, we are our biggest barrier. There are so many things that are possible in our cities if we just allow ourselves to do them. And this is a really great example here in the neighborhood where I work in Brooklyn. That street is iconic. It is framed by the Manhattan Bridge, and you can see the Empire State Building in the arch. Now this, as Instagram has become popular, this street has really become a destination for people around the globe. And so at any given time, there are 10 times more people in the street taking photos, doing social activity than people who are driving. So we studied this street for a while, and of course there was a political pushback on not to really change it. But the pandemic has brought about this transformation so quickly and so cheaply that you see just some squares there outlined in colorful tape, and then tables and chairs put within them. And it's just transformed the space. It's how people have always wanted to use this street. And it's that drives home the point that we make up all sorts of rules, we make up all sorts of excuses, we look at the politics and say none of this can happen. And then you never know. Suddenly something happens as unfortunate as a pandemic or an earthquake, a flood, and all of a sudden, creativity gets unleashed. And now we're seeing this all over New York City. And I think it's a really important point that if we want to have better cities and more inclusive cities, we have to get out of our own way and allow them to succeed. So I will end it there and look forward to the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those points. I think, this pandemic, with all its kind of horrifying outcomes, is also an opportunity to transform. And I think that point came out very well in your manifesto as well. Thanks, Mike. Alex, I'm going to just share your 3 images here.
Yeah. So, well, to me, it's been, that was interesting. Like, that was really nice to see those 3 points. To me, there's kind of 3 questions that's been quite important to the way that we facilitate and organize our participatory projects. So the first one, which is the image you see here, is a question about how we make things together, or how we make decisions together. This image shows sociologist Nicole Curato conducting a deliberative session in Manila, Philippines. So we've been so lucky to work with her on a couple of our previous projects, and we learned about her work and insights on deliberative democracy. And as opposed to representative democracy processes where people choose who will be represented or choose who they will be represented by. And, I think these kind of deliberative processes invites people to engage in the discussions and the reflections and the thoughts that underlie the decisions that are being made together. So this is the question of how we can collectively reason and argue for the choices that we make, and how people can be involved in these processes that affect them is like really relevant when we talk about participatory work in general. So I think the next slide, that's the next question for me, is how can we actually act on these decisions that we do together? In this regard, we work with this concept that we have here in Norway, which is called dugnad. This is a tradition where a group of people come together to work towards a shared goal. So in the photo, you can see a tech dugnad. This is basically a collaborative effort of laying roof tiles. So these traditions exist all over the world in different forms, and they provide means for communities to self-organize and work towards a common goal. In English, I think the closest tradition would be something like mutual aid or mutual support. Historically, these are traditions that exist in the rural parts of society, and it's been used to cope in the face of changing seasons, calamities, natural and human disasters. It has also become quite clear or visible now in the kind of case of the pandemic. In Norway, it made its way into the cities and kind of through the factories during the Industrial Revolution. And it's been a platform to discuss politics, beliefs, and arguably also was part of forming the labor unions and the Norwegian welfare state. So this is an important tradition for us. But these traditions, they do predate the market economy, and they are based on social relations and social ties. They address this aspect of resilience as well. It's been a way of coping. So in the case of placemaking and urbanism, this can kind of also be an important platform to engage people on their own terms. This is traditions that people know how it works here, at least. And these organizational structures, they belong to the place, but they also, they offer a platform to do something physically rather than just talking about something. Which brings me to the third question, which has been important to me, which is this question about knowledge and capacity building. Because both deliberative platforms and mutual support structures are ways to bring people together, discuss, and to work face to face. But it's through the act of making things together that we can discover a whole new set of knowledges and experiences that maybe isn't as obvious when we just talk to each other. So taking ownership of these decisions made and the way they were being implemented is important when we talk about the long-term impact of the projects that we do, and the operation, the transformation, and the use of these projects. This image is Boboy, one of our community members in Tacloban, Philippines, describing the reasoning behind the design and the building of a set of door mock-ups that they've kind of developed from a mapping exercise in the community. And this is a project we did, before and after a super typhoon destroyed the city in 2013. It was a super typhoon Haiyan. But this community, they have this kind of knowledge of how to build resilient in face of natural disaster. And what he was explaining is the way that you can open a building and let the winds pass through, and by doing that, the building can withstand much stronger winds than what it would if we were trying to push against the winds. And that actually allowed the first project that we built before the typhoon to survive the peak of the winds. It was destroyed by the waves, the storm surge, but it did manage to survive the winds. And I think that's a strong point in terms of how there's a lot of knowledge that isn't really articulated in words or spoken words, and that we do need to find other ways of communicating and exchanging knowledge so that these kind of informations and knowledge can be part of forming the kind of urban or the physical landscape that we engage with. That was my 3 things. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I think both of your points highlighted the power of community in making transformation happen and kind of empowering them with tools, that will allow us to achieve some of those goals. So thank you.
Well, I really appreciated hearing both of your manifestos because for one reason amongst many, I think that it revealed so many fertile points of convergence between your approaches. I mean, basically what you have in common is that you really do care about how cities work from a human point of view. You care about the building of social capital. You care about what the real needs are. And these processes are very, very creative. They can be improvised, but they basically they don't just take people along with them. People are actually fundamental to the evolution and the development of absolutely everything, however modest a scale it's on. So that prompts my question, which is obviously we've seen a lot of very many advantages during the pandemic of tactical urbanism, and I think those of us watching the building of the movement that Mike and his colleagues have been responsible for over a decade, we've seen how advantageous and beneficial they can be. So are there any differences in tactical urbanism and participatory work, depending on whether it's done in a more top-down way, working with local municipalities or with companies, other third sector agencies, or whether it's purely bottom-up, or whether it can, as is very often the case, is in fact a hybrid of the two, because some projects can be initiated by community groups and never involve the municipalities, and others appear from the municipalities. I think then finally there's just this point I think Mike said about how the unsanctioned becomes the sanctioned, which is a really interesting question as well. So obviously there are differences, but in what way are they meaningful differences? Maybe we start with Mike.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think what we focus on a lot in our work is thinking about cities as an ecosystem, right? Where you need leadership, you need sources of funding for projects, you need city staff to support projects or to lead projects. You also need people in neighborhoods who have all of the knowledge, who may not be experts about their place and their community, what they're looking to see as a positive transformation moving forward. So we like to frame things as not either or, bottom up or top down, but like you said, a hybrid where everybody has a role to play in making the city. And that's sort of my, that's sort of my fanciful goal, is that we create these ecosystems and systems and put these systems in place where that's entirely possible and normal. Of course, we know that's not always the case. So today, I think what's really great about bottom-up activism and urbanism is that it's very swift. It's usually very much about a small scale, very few resources, and it tends to prove a point from an advocacy perspective. It communicates a need or a wish by a group of people, if not a broader neighborhood or set of constituents. And it can very quickly raise attention to the deficiencies that we find in our urban living arrangements. And so that's definitely the upside, the positive side of bottom-up activism. I think where that struggles is to scale. So if you are in a neighborhood and you feel privileged, safe, or you feel allowed to act in a way that might technically be unsanctioned, there's a privilege in that, right? If you feel that way, you may not have the resources, ability to translate that to be beneficial for people in many neighborhoods, or nor may that be appropriate. And so the role of a city is to enable that work and scale that work citywide. And I think the tactical urbanism projects that we get engaged in that are most successful are able to do that, where the city plays an important role as facilitator, as perhaps funder, but from a process perspective, from a leadership perspective, it can also be something that empowers neighborhood groups and advocates and small business owners, et cetera, to try things and to make changes in the built environment. And when we get involved with projects, we tend to be a bridge between those two groups: the city government, who understand the processes, the funding streams, the roles, the challenges of being in a bureaucracy. And then we also, as advocates and activists ourselves, understand where people are coming from at the neighborhood level, who just want to see something quickly done that's positive and supports their goals and wishes. So, we try to build that bridge and make it so we have these bottom-up and top-down approaches that can be married and create a better methodology for delivering more resilient cities.
Something to the effect that, you're an architect and a planner, so it's relatively easy to create a two-dimensional vision of illustrations, from your computer, but it's a lot harder to create urban change in three dimensions. And the demonstration aspect of tactical urbanism is somehow one that, if done well, it engenders trust amongst the community, because it's there in in real time, in one-to-one scale.
Yeah, people don't understand a map or a plan view drawing or even a section drawing as urbanists and architects and planners do. And by the way, I'm not an architect; I'm an urban planner and designer. I want to misrepresent my profession, but yeah, I mean,
they do to the extent that the architects and the planners would wish them to. That's for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So translating things, one-to-one, gives people that what we call a rendering in real time. Gives them that real experience. And what's great about that is that people can point to things that are very clear that are not working. And so we look for positive solutions and things that work. But I think more importantly, particularly in the first iteration of a project, we're looking for the things that don't work well. So we're not wasting time and resources investing in the things that don't function as people wish.
Yeah, yeah. So Alex, how do you respond to this? The innate versatility of tactical urbanism, which you may not have termed it as part of your practice, but I honestly think that's what you are doing in the wider sense. It can work together with municipalities on its own. How do you compare the two? Are they all really necessary?
I mean, I think like Mike was saying, I think there really needs to be a variety of approaches to the urban kind of development and so on. But I mean, from where I come, where my own practice is, trying to look at how there are existing structures where people can take part in these decisions, and you can create the conditions where they can be part of reasoning and making, maybe these real-time renderings that could then contribute to give shape to the built environment. Because, there is this real issue of like communication and language, and one thing is drawings, the other thing is words. I mean, even words and conversations can be incredibly complicated to get into, especially if you're just entering a participatory session or a meeting, and people present their ideas, and how do you engage with it? So there really needs to be, I think it's important to reflect on the way that we create a mutual understanding for the decisions and the choices and implementations that we go for. And this is where I think, traditions such as, that already exist in a place are important, and it's important to use the words and the concept that exist in a specific place so that it belongs to the people that actually are engaged in it. Mutual support, dugnad, is not necessarily bottom up or top down. It's meant to be horizontal. So the point is that you're really not measured by your status or social status or income or so on. It's really by the time that you invest in these sessions that over a period of time. So I think there are a lot of ways to engage people, and I think it's important to do most of it, and then to create a way to to bring people into discourses that they're normally not part of.
And on the point of working with local authorities, excuse me, working with local authorities, you've had a very productive relationship with the project that we worked on together for Oslo. Maybe just say something quickly about that. I mean, your client, the client, Lars, was not so aware of how you might function as a creative mediator, but now he's become very, very converted to the whole way of operating, hasn't he?
Yeah, this is a very nice process that me and Lucy, and together with Mattias Josefsson, Maria Ortun, and Studar Shankadka, has been kind of developing with the local municipality, where we're trying to see how we can basically, instead of waiting for a long-term proposal, which might take up to 10 years, there's a need for a community center. How can we use mutual dugnad to organize the community to develop the proposal, the initiatives, and the program, so that we can already start now and build maybe an iteration of this 10-year-long project. So now we're working with the municipality and the community to develop a series of designs, and construction has started through dugnad to then develop this community center. And that has been a positive process where both the municipality is present, the community is present, and people engage in those sessions with their ideas and with their understandings of what this community center needs to be. This is in the suburbs of Oslo, so it's really like under provided communities. My old family basically comes from there, but this community doesn't have enough social infrastructure. So then really, how can we create a platform where the community and the municipality can find some common ground and then invest in that? So now this is kind of still ongoing. Yeah.
Brilliant. And they're very heartened by the reality that it's possible to make these things happen in less than a year, which is still a tactical urbanist time frame, isn't it? For sure. I mean, it's also a catalyst for other things as well, and they're learning a lot in the process. We'll ask you a little bit more about dugnad just a tiny bit later. So thank you very much for that. And Prathima.
Mike, you mentioned that your big fanciful goal is to create an ecosystem that enables bottom-up change and empowers communities to make change happen. Now, how do you create this ecosystem, and how can cities embrace this and create an environment conducive to participation, co-creation, and community problem solving?
That's a great question, and we've been trying to answer it for 10 years. But I think, honestly, primarily it's about defining roles, right, and understanding what the base primary concerns of various actors are, and being able to do their job, be able to advocate to do what they want to do in terms of a project or change in the public realm. And we've had a chance to do that in a number of cities where we've defined those roles and designed a process through which people who may not be experts but want to see the parking space in front of their business turned into a place to eat and drink and socialize, or a wide road where there might be a chance to make a community plaza, right? We've seen these kinds of projects, but the challenge with them, and we learned this very quickly, I would say in the first 4 or 5 years of our practice, is that we were being hired to do a project with a community but then the community couldn't then do another project or another project or another project because one, they weren't a consultant expert, and two, there was no process that we could leave behind that could be replicated. So, in a few cities, we've gotten, the fire department and the police and community groups and the planning department and the parks department and all the people who help make decisions and put them into a room together and said, okay, fire department, what is your most basic concern about being able to respond to a emergency? Let's make sure we design around that. And let's design around, the parks department's goals of adding enough, green space or tree canopy to the city. And let's design around the transportation planning department goal of X mile of new, cycleways in the city. So basically trying to create all these overlapping little circles and designing a process around that so that everyone feels like they're heard, and that two, everyone understands what their role might be in working with community groups to deliver these demonstration or pilot projects to inform lasting investment. So we've developed maybe 5 or 6 of those types of policies and programs in cities across the globe. And it's been interesting to see the result. I'd say they're not perfect. There's still a process which can be a turnoff and a challenge to project proponents who are not, hired as consultants, who are not working within the city structure. But we've certainly seen some successes and wins come out of these processes as well. So we're really still trying to figure this out. But I think it's where there's great potential to really just lessen the demand on community groups. And, if you want to try something for a day, it shouldn't take 1 year to get permission to do it. And so we're really figuring out how to kind of co-design those processes collectively. And it's an interesting process.
I think I think there's another book or a series in that, Mike, telling the rest of the world how to, enable this ecosystem that can problem solve on their own. Alex, I want to talk a little bit more about this. This approach enables different actors and stakeholders to engage in a discourse that was historically and often is been the realm of planners and architects. Can we talk a little bit about how this can be, one, limiting, or two, really creative, given that the users and community can actually physically test out some of these designs or, experiment with it?
Well, I mean, like if you call for, I keep coming back to this word, but this is really where I'm coming from in terms of my practice. But if you call for a dugnad, people expect that they're going to do something physically. Even if they don't really know necessarily what it's going to be, they'll show up. At the end of the session, you're going to have food. It's going to be social. So, somehow I think that when you're going to do something, you kind of need to test things out physically. You need to try, you need to fail. And what kind of platforms can you create where people can do this? Like Mike also trying to bring in different actors so that there is different perspectives on things that you're testing out. And, so that there is some kind of discourse being developed in that process. I mean, ecosystems is interesting because it's kind of how, what is all these kind of systems that are at play at the same time, and how can you maneuver these without actually engaging all these different elements at the same time in the same discussion. So, I think that's kind of central the point to that in a way. Yeah. But yeah, please. That's kind of, I think, which I also know from your work, Mike, is that you keep making things physically, and you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again. And in that process, I think there is a whole learning, and there's this learning that's happening in the trying and failing and trying and failing, and the physical doing of it, physical testing of it. And because so many things, they just end up becoming abstract. They're empty words, or they're like things that you can't relate to. You can't relate your experience. You can't tell a story about it because it kind of somehow is just abstract knowledge. So how can we actually bring all this kind of knowledge together from this abstract into the specific, and then create an experience for people that are together in a place where they are faced with these different issues or agendas or interests, so that they actually can have a relationship to these different points of view. And then, you make something again, and you do that again. I think that's creative, right? Creativity is about trying to deal with an issue that you can't really put your finger on, and you try to solve it in a creative way. And by bringing different people together, you kind of somehow are going to have to be creative about what you're going to come to a conclusion about, because making something new is a negotiation. Yeah.
You're right. Yeah, I think community is the expert in how to kind of decode the ideas and values that they already know about, becomes easier with this type of a process. And often the traditional architecture and urbanism practice ignores that the value within the community and the users. Yeah.
And actually now with the pandemic, I think it's become very visible to a lot of people. I mean, also from our experience working in the Philippines with natural disasters occurring there, there's, resilience is about being able to deal with your own situation when it's necessary.
Right.
And suddenly when there's a calamity, what's going to happen is that the structures that you expect to support you are no longer there. And then you need to do something about the situation yourself. So you kind of need to have all these levels of society all functioning at the same time, so that when a calamity happens, when a disaster happens, we can somehow cope and we can manage. So I think very interesting point, the second slide you have, Mike, in terms of resilient cities. I think that's, and we need to keep talking about this and what that means in terms of decision making, in terms of implementation, in terms of every aspect of society, really.
And community capacity is probably the key part of resilience. So I think that really came through with both of your points.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. It's not necessarily about money, though that money is good to deal with some problems, but it's not about infrastructure per se. It's about this capacity to manage and deal with things. And once you have that in place, then with the resources you have at hand, you can figure out what to do.
Exactly.
Definitely. Which leads on maybe to my question about how you have actually influenced Mike, specifically for you. This is how you feel that you and your collaborators have influenced actual government policies. Did you also write your Tactical Urbanism book with one motivation to definitely to influence government forces? Do you think you've been successful? How has it manifested over the last decade?
I mean, it's transformed practice, and maybe not the full way that we would like to see at scale globally, but we've seen, I think we started talking about this idea basically as something that we were observing, a decade ago, and seeing in the global financial crisis how advocates for livable communities were not stopping their work. And even if official funding streams stopped, the work continued, and then it inspired city officials to then invest in some of those changes. That was really interesting. And so we documented both bottom up and top down changes that were being made to cities as these in a form of tactics, right? But it wasn't until 2014, so about 4 years later, that we actually saw in the United States the very first tender to work on a project billed as Tactical Urbanism. We wound up, winning that project, which was a good stepping stone for us. But it's really, I think, a moment where a regional government in Atlanta hired us. And so it was this watershed moment for us, just personally thinking that, okay, we've got the trust of a very large bureaucracy working at a regional scale, interested in applying this approach. And since then, and since all the writing that we've done and all the talks and the webinars, et cetera, over years, it's just spread globally to the point where, whole countries like New Zealand are now leaning on tactical urbanism as a form of recovery from the pandemic, or to meet all their other climate change and mobility goals. And there's things that we're seeing both from the bottom up and the top down at a global scale that we have no involvement with whatsoever. But the principles are there, and they're being applied in unique ways that are related to place. And it's great to see that we don't have to be, and nor do we want to be or could be involved in every application of tactical urbanism. What I'm still seeing a shortage of, though, is a replicable process that cities can utilize, and developing an approach that includes as many actors as possible. I think that is the next step for so many cities who, let's say in the last 2 or 3 years, have really taken on this work, or started to fund this work, and are working hand in hand with local community groups to deliver some projects. Is this figuring out how to do this not more than one time, to do this more than one time. And that's where the benefit really starts to get conferred on a citywide scale, is when you can, replicate not a project, but replicate a process. And we're still a long way from doing that. And so there's still a lot of work to be done.
Well, that's really heartening to hear in terms of the political transitioning, and also I completely take your point that while there's huge benefit to tactical projects in the individual ones being very bespoke and tailored to particular contexts and social, economic, cultural conditions, there's a huge benefit to drawing out awareness of replicable processes as well that people can be inspired by. Thank you for that. So Alex, we're going to look at, very briefly, we're going to look at dugnad, which of course is the ultimate form of participatory tactical practice in Norway. Traditionally, you can tell me when the very first dugnad project ever took place, but you're reinventing its creative role as a mechanism to fast track social change. What comes with the territory when you're doing that, in terms of the implications of democratic ownership, or that if it's done properly, dugnad builds amongst the community members involved? That's 2 questions in one, but that's what I'm famous for, actually.
But I think what's interesting with these traditions is, democratically, it's a form of direct democracy. Yeah. This is a form of organizing, and it doesn't necessarily need to be democratic. It can also lead to decisions where someone wants someone to take the lead, and it's not at all democratic. So that's also the case with deliberative democracy. It can lead to something where people might decide that someone just takes the lead, and that's. But I think what's maybe interesting with these traditions is that they exist all over the world, and they exist before we kind of started this kind of this whole neoliberal conflict that we are feeling right now. And I think that there is the huge potential try to see how these traditions can be useful. Most people here, and my experience also working in the Philippines, is that people have an association to these forms of organizing oneself. So that means that there is a assumption that is different than when you facilitate a collaborative session by saying, let's have a workshop. It's a whole different principle at play. And so what we've been trying to do, and this for the Venice Biennale together with Sudarshan Kadka. And the title is called Structures of Mutual Support, and it's looking at how these different traditions around the world can inform an architectural practice. And there are, in this context, we've had Nicole Curato contributing, as well as experts on mutual support and dugnad in Norway and abroad. And there is some principles that you can kind of talk about in terms of how these systems work, or these traditions works. And they are, basically they're organized around the need to do something collectively. It's a physical act, so people come together to work together. It relies on the social capital of the people there, social ties. So it's often celebrated with food and drinks and so on. There's also a sense of social obligation, so that the reason that people come together is also feeling because they have to, for the common good, basically. And there is a time aspect. So, the currency of these traditions is not money, it's the time invested in the project. And actually one of our contributors said it quite nicely. He explained how your impact on a project is not measured by your status or money, but basically by the time that you've invested and in the kind of sessions that are organized. These are, of course, informal structures for collaborations that emerge, and in Norway today people are mostly using it for like cleaning their gardens, or when I grew up we had to fix the road once a year, so we come together, all the neighbors, and we fix the road. But again, historically these traditions have had political implications, and they are also something that we shouldn't talk naively about, because they can also be abused as a means to get others to do what you want them to do. There are cases where governments or big businesses are using these terms to argument for collaboration on something that they need to achieve. So in the case of the pandemics, there's a lot of different nations around the world calling for this mutual support, or this support mechanisms to achieve a certain goal defined by, say, a government. And then, people will then, apply, but actually it's really not at their own best interest. So these are, they can be abused, they can be used, and so on. But in terms of how we use this in an architectural process, we facilitate a series of dugnad sessions with the community. And by doing that, trying to actually do like Mike, try to engage in physical making and discussion. Each session is about making something physical that we then can kind of reflect on collectively, but also these physical objects become somehow an archive of ideas and discussions and opinions that we can always look back at. And at the end of the process, ideally, you have a building or intervention or a project from it that, most people that have been part of the process can argument. You don't necessarily need to agree about every aspect of the process, but they can at least have an opinion about when a decision was made, why it was made, how it was made, and how that was translated into a physical decision. Yeah, that was a long speech.
Well, when you finished your PhD, you're going to prepare your book, aren't you? Just like Mike.
Yeah, well, I do. Oh, right. Yeah, okay, so I'm also doing a PhD on this. So this is, I'm obsessed by this concept.
We didn't see that before, did we? Yes, definitely. Camila Chapella has just commented. She says she really likes the currency of time. Very interesting perspective on the concept of resources. So you've got a fan already. So.
But I mean, I think what's interesting with that is that what is the most valuable thing we all have is the time that we got in this world. We live for a certain amount of time, and that's it. So what's the most valuable thing you can give is your time. And what can you give it to? If you do give it to something that we do, if you give it to the collective, it's a generous act. So it's also something very important, and it should be treated that way. So these traditions are ways for people to contribute to a project, even though they don't necessarily have the monetary capital to do so. And it's really important that there are other platforms in society where we can engage in politics, where we can engage in design, where we can engage in making that isn't only, determined by our social status or position in, economically or socially, so.
Yeah. Right. I want to talk about a macro idea on how we dealt with future of cities historically. We always had master plans and big long-term development plans, and in places like India, that's been a disaster. We currently, in the biggest city in the country, Mumbai, don't have a proper development plan because there's so much of arguments and discussions on it. So we are living without one at this point in time. And I remember Jaime Lerner, the great mayor of Curitiba in Brazil, who transformed his city, once said that the lack of resources is no longer the excuse not to act. The idea that all action has to be taken after, all resources are allocated or all solutions are out there is a sure recipe for paralysis. And we've seen that in multiple cities around the world. Mike, the framework of tactical urbanism, in a way, looks for short-term action for enabling long-term change, which was the kind of tagline of your book. And it seeks quick results, and it's based on experimentation and the power of community. Now, as an expert, how do you catalyze the best actions? And what are the limitations of this approach for urban revival at a large scale?
It's a great question. That's the inherent tension in the work, is that, I'm a planner, right? Personally, I think about 50 years from now, I think about what my son will be doing in his quality of life when he's my age. This is real, that you mentioned from having Lerner's great quote. And we can't use it as an excuse not to act, and that's the primary point about tactical urbanism. But we're trying to make sure we're linking our actions to some sort of framework or bigger idea or concept or goal that has been articulated or can be informed by the action where the goal might come out of that. And if you don't make the linkage between the short term and the long term, then you might be doing a nice project, but we wouldn't call it tactical necessarily, right? We're trying to enact some sort of longer term sustained resilient change in a city, and that can start at the street corner, and it can start at the block scale, it can start across a neighborhood, let's say with a street or a corridor. It's very difficult to do it at a single go at it in a single project. That's just not the framework that tactical urbanism can impact, right? But if you do enough of these projects, if you have a framework of scaling it, then you can make an impact citywide, absolutely. And so from a top-down perspective, I think about the Plaza program here in New York City. And it's been a famous model now for a decade, but it's one that absolutely was scalable. There's now more than 70 different plazas, and most of those came to fruition over a 4 or 5 year period under the last mayoral administration. So at a local scale, at a calibrated, this is the goals of public space, of access to public space, access to each other socially, to the economy. These spaces can be individually designed, but the framework is such that you can build 70 of them that started in a temporary state. Some of them are still in temporary state or interim state, but then can be invested in over time, particularly once the programming and the design and use is understood. That's the moment to then invest longer term, bigger resources. So, there's that scale issue, but it's not to say we can't impact the citywide scale. It's just we have to start with something that's much smaller. And we have to learn from the first, second, the third, the fifth example, so that when we get to the 35th and the 55th, we really know what the process is. We know how to, streamline the work. We know how to work with a variety of community groups and make a positive impact at a city or regional scale. So it's like these nested actions that have to be always thinking about the big picture, but are starting with what needs to be done on the street corner.
It's really a matter of culture, isn't it? And creating that world where community is problem solving. You're in a way redistributing governance in the hands of local community and crowdsourcing problem solving. And for everybody joining us, the guide that Mike worked on is available online for all of you to kind of use it in your own cities. Is it tacticalurbanismguide.com, Mike? Is that correct?
Yeah, all of our latest resources are there.
It's open source for all of us to use, and it's such a great way to make change happen towards more healthier and more happier communities. Alex, if in this process of collective problem solving, one of the themes that you mentioned was how to tap into collective knowledge and the shared kind of knowledge of the community. How do you do that? And how do you kind of push and trigger the best ideas forward when you do that?
I think there is, of course, all this knowledge that is formalized, and you can easily present it and say that I know this or I know that. But I think there's also all this, this concept of tacit knowledge, this knowledge that you really can't put your word on, And I think a lot of people, they walk around with a lot of experience in their life, stories and knowledge that they don't necessarily manage to articulate in words. So I think for us to be able to, basically it's about spending time together. That's number one. The other one is actually doing something together, and in doing something together, these things emerge, right? How maybe a story from your childhood about dealing with a certain issue can have an importance now in the issue that you're now facing, or maybe there are commonalities amongst people that having an issue that they need to solve, but they have a perception of it that maybe I, as an architect, wouldn't have. I mean, this example from the Philippines that I was giving, that was a really important point when the community was describing how taking off the walls of a house and letting the wind pass through is the best way to deal with a disaster, rather than building a concrete house that's just going to be destroyed by the next earthquake or the typhoon. Even the typhoons can rip off a concrete, structure. So, how can we identify knowledge is where, you're going to humbly adapt and engage with that knowledge rather than, pre-assume formalized knowledges or so on. So, and that is a creative process also, right? I mean, like we're all learning together. That's the whole point, that you create a condition where we are collectively exploring something, people with different expertise, whether it's the expertise of place or if it's the expertise of your profession, but that you engage and you spend time together exploring something. And that is, it could be a built project, it can be, in our case, it's built projects, or it's interventions, or it's exhibitions, or it's biennale projects, or whatever you engage with, as long as you do spend that time and you explore it based on the positions that the people are there, acknowledge that there are different experiences. And with that, you can always create something that, reveals a set of knowledge that is then relevant, I think. Don't know if it answers exactly, but I think that's the potential of spending time and doing something together. Yeah.
Learning by doing, I think that's what tactical urbanism is about, right?
Absolutely.
I just want to say hello to this amazing community that joined us today. Hi, Camilla, Thomas, and Ashok, and Ola, and Sampath. There's a ton of comments and questions. And please stay connected with us and hit the subscribe button or the like button if you're on Facebook, and subscribe button if you're on YouTube. We'd love to stay in touch with you. Please send us your questions for our two speakers, and we'll try to take a few of them. Lucy?
Okay, so one last quick question from each of us. No, one quick question from me, I think, very, very quickly. Mike, what I'm intrigued by is how you go about measuring, collecting, and using the data through your tactical urbanism projects, which is obviously going to be of use to the community you're working with. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's all manners of tools for collecting data, and so anything that I could list would not be that big of a surprise, I think, to a lot of our audience. But I think what's more important than the tools is the what and the why. You need to really define what your goals are from the outset and develop that criteria that would help make a project successful in the eyes of a community group or a city or government, et cetera, that's engaging in the project. And once you have that established, then you figure out the best ways to measure against those goals. And that will help tell the story of success or failure as defined by what you're trying to achieve. And so if you don't undertake that step and take that step seriously, and you just jump into the tools and we're going to measure this, it may not be as powerful in terms of communicating the story that people want to tell or the learnings that people want to undertake as part of the process. So, roughly there's digital and there's analog tools. You can be counting people, you can be, quantitative and qualitatively analyzing space. You use camera technology, and there's a lot of that out there that's getting cheaper and cheaper and easier to use. Speed data, there's all sorts of ways we can measure the built environment. So that's not the problem. It's just figuring out the best way to do it for the goals you're trying to achieve. Yeah,
great. And also, Alex, thinking about the digital and the analog ways in which you can help empower the community members that you work so that they can take their learning further forward and be confident that it will support them for any future projects that they do. Has this kind of provoked any thoughts before we move to quick questions from the audience about your own practice?
You're thinking about the digital physical medium.
Yeah, well, maybe basically what you already do through the digital and the analog, and perhaps provoking any new thoughts about the ways in which you can help empower them. Because sooner or later you leave the project and then they carry on themselves and they are empowered. Yeah. But are there other ways of thinking about this?
But I think this is, the ability to articulate a situation means that you also have the capacity to possibly act on it. And very often it's very hard to understand maybe what an issue is, or what is the actual problem that I'm finding myself in. And actually to work together with a group of people and to articulate a common issue or problem is extremely powerful. But that means the moment you manage to articulate an issue that you can collectively agree is something we need to do something about, you actually start, that's already starting to create a movement, right? So the moment you have an agreement about something, you can start doing something about it. So I think, this is where I'm obviously not, I don't know a lot about deliberative democracy, but I'm learning a lot from Nicole. And I think this is incredibly interesting because it's a way for people to, despite differences, at least be able to articulate their position and then somehow understand the other's position. I think in society, there's so much division and there's so much lack of understanding of the other that it's hard to mobilize for a common cause. And I think there's a real need to start thinking about how we understand the situation we're in and where can we find some kind of common ground to do something about it. That's powerful when something then happens, like a pandemic or something.
Yeah, that's truly powerful. Thank you. Prathima?
Should we go into audience questions? We have a couple. Actually, we have a few, and I'm going to curate a couple of them. We have one from Ola, who's asking us about how do you protect communities from co-option by the state? The agency of the state is a thing that has been able to make urbanism that has often focused on economy and not community well-being or development of the community. It's been we've seen we've been in the era of speculative capitalism, and the state has often been about just finances and not and GDP growth and not about community well-being. So how do you ensure that the state doesn't co-opt this process? Does anybody want to comment?
It's a big question. Could take 4 years of study to get through, but I think broadly it's we in the capitalist societies and webinar listening in now in capitalist societies, but we really struggle with just that. I think changing around the metrics of which we're measuring success is really fundamental to taking the burden off of the sole focus of economy, right? And that can be, there's a number of people and experts who are well beyond my field of knowledge around happiness and community and other ways to measure productivity that just don't align with capitalist systems. And so I think it's hard to just change the underlying structure of that working on a single architecture project or in a single community or a single city. These all exist in a globally tied and connected system that really does push a very specific agenda around the economy and the economic goals. So I have no direct answer for you, but I think it's recognizing that issue and then thinking through, again, back at the small scale, how we can engender processes and projects that speak to or more broadly define the goals of the work can start to counteract some of those concerns that you've raised, which are good ones.
Yeah. And like this is, if more people focus on this, the issue of of their own communities, you'll probably see less misappropriation by the public agency or government. We should pick one question, which is kind of linked. It's about the policy and regulative environments, and often tactical urbanism is also called guerrilla urbanism once, right? Because sometimes you have to do things outside the sanction of the state. And Thomas speaks about examples in India where a lot of communities come up unplanned, informal communities, and they're later legalized. Will this be accepted? And Sampath has another question similar to that, where he is thinking about interventions where in housing where regulations are too rigid. How can you explore tactical housing intervention in places where things are highly regulated. How do we, I think the big question here is that how do you engage with the legislative framework and the codes that the cities already have as you try to make these interventions happen?
These are great questions, everybody. Every project that we do, even when it's formally sanctioned by a city government hiring us, is still almost illegal, right? We're still having to break the rules and work through a system that's was never designed to contemplate, let alone implement the kinds of projects that we do. So it's very difficult. Again, we always feel like we're reinventing the wheel, which is why several years ago we turned more towards the policy framework to enable others to do it once we've come through and worked with the community. In the specific context of India, I have very little knowledge about the precise regulatory environment around housing and informal settlements, et cetera. But I would offer one thing, and maybe Alex can shine a lot brighter light on this, which is that there's a lot of knowledge, working knowledge and skill that is built up and transacted and shared in those environments. And to ignore that in terms of supporting it is a problem, is a challenge, I assume. And so being able to think about a process where you can deliver life safety, right? You can deliver clean water. You can, if there's fires, you can combat, things that alter the safety of people who live in a certain environment without going so far as to formalize every activity, make it so rigid, follow every single rule, which again was probably not contemplated for that type of environment, should be under strong consideration, and coming up with methodologies to engage those communities to have those conversations, such as Alex does, and think through what the local solutions can be to those tensions between formal and informal, and safety, concerns, as well as concerns over like creative living and informal economies and how people depend on that to live.
I should say that Berlin has some great examples of creating affordable housing through actions that are often considered illegal, but it's just superbly creative. Camilla from Tampa, Florida asks about participatory and community research and design and planning. They've been practiced for several years. What is new at the moment? Do you think COVID could potentially change something? Alex, do you want to take that one?
Well, I don't know what is new, but I think there's a lot of work that's being done over the past decades that's still super relevant today. So I don't think it's necessarily about whether it's new or not. I think, participatory action research, you have collaborative design thoughts and ideas that are still super relevant today. I'm incredibly fascinated by Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of the oppressed and these kind of ideas that was written a long time ago, but it's extremely relevant today also in terms of how we articulate the situation that we're in, how we deal with those situations, and how we actually act on those situations. So, maybe Mike knows more about what's new, but I think definitely the work that has been done is still relevant. And that, I think in the case of COVID, what we're seeing is a lot more self-organized. Actually, from my point of view, in Norway, they've been using dugnad a lot. Philippines, they've been talking a lot about bayanihan. These words of mutual support are appearing in a much more frequent way now that the calamity has happened and we all agreed that we need to do something about it. And this mechanism has, they're always there. They're part of us being human, that we work together when there is a disaster. So I think somehow what COVID is doing is shedding light on the need to self-organize and help each other when something is happening. So all this theory thinking that's been done over the past 30, 40 years is super relevant, but it's articulating something that is just basically human. I think the need for us to work together. Yeah.
I would just quickly weigh in too and say that we wrote a whole chapter in our book about the history of tactical urbanism that, to Alex's point, we didn't invent this, right? We put a term around it and it promoted a framework that people have adopted and adapted. but it's certainly not new. And it's really, really important to recognize that. So I appreciate Alex bringing that up. There's so much knowledge that's been shared for decades. What's new, I think, globally is the internet, and that we can share so quickly and freely and learn from each other just as we are right now in a way that was impossible in the 60s and 70s, which is a period of time that I look to a lot for inspiration, when a lot of activists were in streets and planting gardens and doing things that are really interesting in cities, and at least in the American context, that I found fascinating, that inform what we do today. But they didn't have the power of the internet to share those actions and those photos and those examples to teach and excite and inspire other people. And we have that today, which is great.
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions and comments. Camilla, we made a note of the point that you made, that we need a new generation of public official willing and able to provide flexible interpretation of codes to accommodate innovative projects. Thanks for that. And I think that's probably so crucial to make all of this work and empower communities to make changes for better. Lucy?
Yeah, and I think, say, for example, just by way of closing, I think, from a developer's perspective, certainly in terms of the UK, developers are now far more interested in tactical urbanism than they ever were, because precisely for the reasons that Mike referred to earlier, which is this ability to create a framework that links the long term to the short term. And the short term can be a seed or a catalyst for the long term. I mean, you could look at it in a slightly cynical way, but at the same time, I think people are genuinely putting their hearts and soul into the quality of tactical urbanism now. There's far more awareness, and it is really, really gratifying that this is happening everywhere. And as you say, we can learn about it so immediately through the power of the internet. So I think it's been a really fascinating conversation. Mike and Alex, thank you so much for contributing and giving us your very fascinating viewpoints on all these topics. So we continue with Urban Manifesto, and we thank you very much as an audience for watching. Some of you, excuse me, I know have watched every single episode. So next week is the turn of well-being and happiness. Not that tactical urbanism is not entirely about all of that. We've got Bruce Hayden, the co-founder of Human Studio, together with a well-being expert from Perkins and Will. So that's coming up on the 4th of August, and we look forward to seeing all of you, or any of you who wish to tune in. And definitely it's going to be on YouTube and Facebook if you miss it, in any case. So you can watch it when you have free time. Thank you once again, Mike and Alex and Prathima, for a wonderful session. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.